want to talk about today is interreligious dialogue. An interreligious dialogue consists of two elements. One is religions, and I will talk about that in a moment, and the other is dialogue. Dialogue is a form of communication, and hence it needs a common language, a language in which the parties can communicate, and a language that, since it's interreligious, needs to be learned by at least one of the parties, if not both of the parties. And so hence I want to treat dialogue today in this talk like a learning experience of learning a religion other than one's own. But before I want to talk about dialogue, I want to address the element of religion. And the question is, what is religion? And religion is very difficult to define. There's not really one satisfactory definition because most definitions are either too particularistic and only capture one religion, or they're too general and then they're not meaningful anymore. One of the better definitions, if interpreted broadly, is Max Weber's definition that states that religion is a community of believers whose doctrines and rituals distinguish the sacred from the profane and minister the goods of salvation. However, it's important to keep in mind that religion and religious beliefs are not an abstract set of ideas, values, or experiences, but developed and are still developing within social, economic, historical, and cultural contexts in which the religion comes to expression. And hence, we find beliefs, pattern of observance, organizational structures, and types of religious experiences that are as varied as the matrices in which they develop, form, and reform. And in addition to looking at definitions of religion, I think it's also fruitful to look more descriptively at some of the factors, characteristics, and structures of religious life, elements that are more or less common to all religions, and which then can be a starting point for communication between religions, areas from where dialogue can start. And also these are elements that need to be known or learned about the other religion in order to have a meaningful dialogue. And the characteristic elements that most religions have in common, and I will refer to Islam since I'm an Islamicist in my examples here. One of them is traditionalism. That means religions are in their orientation backward-looking to the origin of the religion. And that usually is expressed by a focus on the original creative action, that be that the life and words of an individual founder or group or scriptures. In Islam, the original creative action centers around the Quran as the word of God revealed to his prophet Muhammad, and the practices of the prophet and that of the early community. And one has to remember that the thrust of traditionalism is, of course, to preserve itself. It's a self-preservation and a deliberate action for a continuity of that tradition. A second element common to probably all religion is that they provide a general view or picture of the world as a whole and the place of the individual therein. In Islam, this general worldview is that God created the world for the benefit of humankind, and they achieve their benefit in this world and the next by following God's commands as revealed to humankind in the Quran and the practice of the Prophet. And here we already see that another element that is common to religions is a concept of salvation. And all religions are basically conceived as a means of saving human beings at one level or another. In Islam, like in the other monotheistic traditions, salvation occurs in the afterlife in form of entering paradise. So there's a belief in otherworldly reward as well as punishment for one's actions in this world. But this world is not necessarily seen as a hostile place or a place of suffering. So the wretched of the earth is certainly not a dominant theme in Islam. There is, one may almost say, earthly salvation by following God's command here on earth. One's life and society is well ordered and also beneficial then to the believer. With the concept of salvation is frequently also associated another commonality that religions show, that is a belief in something sacred. And in Islam, this is connected to the belief in one divine being, God, and his angels and his prophets. The belief in something sacred brings with it usually a distinction between the sacred and the profane. That can be objects as well as abstract concepts. For example, a building, it's a house, and that is profane. But if it's a house of worship, if it's a mosque, then it is sacred. Similar, a carpet is just either decoration or something soft to sit and walk on, but if it's a prayer mat, it becomes a sacred object. And so sacred, what is conceived as sacred is frequently a symbol that stands for more than its physical reality. What it then stands for, of course, is determined or is different and varies from religion to religion. And with the belief in something sacred are also connected usually ritual acts that focus on the sacred, be that particular formulas, but more general also prayer. In Islam, the ritual acts are considered the profession of faith, the prayer, fasting during the month of Ramadan, almsgiving, as well as the pilgrimage to Mecca, a sacred place. Another common element for religions is that they have a sacred scripture. And that can be scripture broadly interpreted, that can be written as well as an oral tradition, just even an oral narratives. And these are usually reported works of holy persons of the past, be that prophets, saints, founder of a faith, or other wisdom. And the scripture in this regard is considered as a statement of truth or wisdom and an exposition of the right way for believers to live. In Islam, again, this is the Quran as God's revealed word, and the hadith as the words and deeds of the prophet sent by God to humanity. And those who live by the sacred scripture, they form then a sacred community that is united by a common belief and practice. And here is where the act of ritual comes into play as well, because ritual is usually a group exercise. And involved in the group exercise are frequently professional ritualists, be that in the Christian tradition a minister or a priest, or in the Islamic tradition the imam, the prayer leader. And the group is also bound together by this experience as one community and the rituals, etc., that form and bind the community together. And religions generally also provide or are a source of a moral code that is believed to have a sacred or supernatural basis. And frequently this sacred or supernatural basis gives it the legitimacy why this moral code applies. Muslims believe that the moral code that judges their conduct is based on God's will as revealed to them through his prophet. And this moral code then informs Muslims about right and wrong. And it's through the fact that religious beliefs and rituals create meaning for human behavior and attitudes that religion is very closely intertwined with the culture that the believer lives in. because culture represents the values, attitudes, behavioral codes that make up a whole way of life for a social group, and it provides the cognitive frameworks and the recipes for social behavior. Hence, we find a very tight interaction, one may say mutual influence, and a reinforcing of religion and culture. And we also find multifaceted expressions of culture where the element of religion and culture cannot neatly be distinguished. For example, in Islam, fasting is on the one hand a religious ritual, but it also has a cultural dimension with it, from visiting friends during the month of Ramadan, exchanging invitations, and this also strengthens the bonds between families, friends. And then there are other cultural elements that come in depending on the context. There are very particular ways that are particular to a specific culture and environment, how to break the fast, what's the first thing to eat, things like that. Similarly, a wedding in Islam, it's not a religious sacrament, so hence it's not considered a religious act per se, but the way a wedding is conducted is very much informed by religious imperatives derived from Islamic law, from the religious law, that you have to have a certain number of witnesses, and who can be a witness, that a dower has to be given. And also religion determines who is marriageable, who can you marry and who can you not. And these religious imperatives then are, of course, in turn influenced by local customs and culture. For example, the amount of the dower that is given, or when is it given? Is it given at the beginning or when the marriage is conducted, or is it given when the marriage is dissolved, like either at death or divorce? So when engaging in interreligious dialogue, it's not enough to engage the other religion on the level of the belief system and doctrines, but one has to engage the culture of that religion. And again, it's important to keep in mind that the interaction between religion and culture means that religious beliefs, concepts, moral codes, etc., are not static and unchanging, but they are fluid in response to changes in the cultural environment, and that they do vary according to the cultural context. And I would like to turn now more to the interreligious dialogue, which is an encounter between different religious traditions, worldviews, and cultures. What's the aim of interreligious dialogue? And if you, for example, look at the website of the UNESCO, where, by the way, interreligious dialogue is very closely defined in relation to intercultural dialogue, it states that the aim of interreligious dialogue is to promote dialogue among different religions, spiritual and humanistic traditions, in a world where conflicts are increasingly associated with religious belonging, and to challenge ignorance and prejudices, and to foster mutual respect. Another view that is more specifically referring to interreligious dialogue between Muslim and Christian can be found here at the Prince Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. The center here at Georgetown is concerned with Islam and the West and Islam in the West. And their aim is to build bridges of understanding between the Muslim world and the West, to address stereotypes of Islam and Muslims, issues and questions such as clash of civilizations, capability of Islam in modern life, democracy, minorities, pluralism, status of women, human rights, as well as America and foreign policy in the Muslim world. So here we see that the dialogue can have very different facets to it and different dimensions. And one may subsume them generally as either referring to the study of religions, comparative religions generally, or intercultural experiences, multiculturalism, and pluralistic societies, as well as the whole nexus of globalism in there. And as mentioned, one of the aims of interreligious dialogue is to foster understanding of other religions in a multicultural and diverse environment. And as a dialogue, it is a form of communication, an interactive communication. In order to have a dialogue with someone whose religious language and culture one does not speak, one has to learn the language and culture of the other religion. One has to acquire interreligious competence and proficiency by learning or studying the other language. And that may be approached in two ways, either religion-specific, with the aim of mastering the worldview and behavior that is specific to a particular religion, or it could be religion general, that one learns about the universal categories of religions, religious differences, so more of a comparative religious approach, with the aim to internalize the cognitive frameworks for religious analysis, to develop an appreciation and respect for one's own religion and for religious difference, and also to deal with the identity issues that attend to interreligious contact. Successful interreligious dialogue needs to be a mix of religion-specific approaches that stress the appreciation of a particular religion, combined with religion-general approaches that address the larger issues of religiocentrism and religious self-awareness. Since interreligious dialogue is a form of communication and a learning experience between different religions and cultures, and its aim is, in the jargon of studies on learning, to attain competence in another religion or in more than one religion. And since this is a process of learning, I believe that the theoretical models that were developed for sequencing intercultural competence also apply to interreligious dialogue. And so this is what I would like to do, compare or lay out a sequence taken from intercultural studies to interreligious studies. So the goal of achieving interreligious competence would mean that a person has the ability, the general ability, to transcend religiocentrism, appreciate other religions, and generate the appropriate behavior when in contact with another religion, and also address larger issues of religiocentrism and religious self-awareness. When acquiring interreligious competence, people will move through 6 stages. And these stages are what most, but certainly not all, learners go through. And also one has to keep in mind that the length a person stays at a particular stage varies, of course, and that also the borders between stages are somewhat fluid. I want to describe these 6 stages and how they are expressed in interreligious dialogue. The first 3 stages are within the realm of religiocentrism, and the second 3 stages are within the realm of religio-relativism. What do I mean by religiocentrism? I mean by that people experience their own religion as central to reality, and hence they avoid the idea of religious difference as an implicit or explicit threat to the reality of their own religious experience. In religious relativism, people consciously recognize that all religious behavior, including their own, exists in a cultural and religious context. They recognize the restrictions that places on their own religious experience, and they seek out religious differences as a means to understand others and as a way of enriching their own experience of reality. The first stage of interreligious competence, which is also the first stage of religiocentrism, is denial. The world is people's current experience of it, and any alternatives to that world are unimaginable. People of other religions are perceived as less human, lacking the real feelings and thoughts of one's own kind. This denial is mainly a function of ignorance, non-information, and also an unawareness of one's own religio-cultural environment. At this stage, one may encounter statements such as the following from Doris Wood, who is a Board of Trustees member at the College of the Siskiyous in California, who objected to proposed classes in Arabic and Middle Eastern history, which were, by the way, the first on that campus, saying, "We know," and here I quote, "we know all we need to know about Arabs and Islam. They are our enemy, pure and simple." And this denial stage is an extreme and also an active dehumanization of the believer of another religion. And this active dehumanization is frequently also associated with genocide situations. The second stage of interreligious competence, which is the second stage of religiocentrism, is defense. The person is more adept at perceiving religio-cultural differences, but the other is still less real, less human, and perceived as stereotype. And there's, for example, the commonly heard association of one of the presidential candidates as being Arab, being Muslim, and hence being a terrorist. In the defense stage, the world is usually organized in them versus us, a denigration of them versus a superiority of us. And this is expressed as a polarization in discussions of religious differences. For example, a statement, "So what do Muslims have against Americans or against America?" And here America is clearly associated with the Christian culture, disregarding the reality of the existing religious pluralism in the US. Typical behavior of somebody at this stage would be to avoid the contact with the other group, with Muslims. And to give you an example, some years ago I was teaching a course, not here at Georgetown, on history of the Middle East. And at the end of the course, one student, she was a graduate student, probably in her late 40s, so not a typical student. She actually went on to become an elementary school teacher. She said that, and here I quote more or less, I can't remember exact words, "I now can imagine being friends with a Muslim." That means that prior she could not have believed that or imagined that. But even at that stage, the other, the Muslim, is still in the realm of the imaginary, is not real. So this person would be somebody who probably during that course went from the denial to early defense stage to the end of the defense stage, close to maybe even already at the next stage, which is the stage of minimization, still in the stage of religiocentrism. In the stage of minimization, people assume a basic similarity among all human beings. They may adopt a transcendent universalism, everyone is a child of God attitude. And differences between religions are subsumed under already existing familiar categories. And this is a general attitude that, well, despite the differences, the other is pretty much like oneself. However, what is still lacking at this stage is the religious self-awareness. So hence a person would not necessarily perceive that the characterization of similarity that one finds between oneself and the other, between, let's say, Christian and Muslims, are based on one's own culture. People are nice towards the other, and emphasize, yes, we are all one under God. And they may argue, for example, for universal human rights, and may criticize in this context Islam for not adhering to this universal standard without any reference and perception that such a position might also be perceived by others as religio-cultural imperialism, since the whole standard of universal human rights comes out of the Western Christian tradition. And at this stage, people also will assume equal opportunities for all people without recognizing that the institutions that are fashioned in their own religious culture's image may offer them and their religious community advantages while hindering the achievement of others. A typical situation, for example, is that Muslim doctors will be expected by their Christian colleagues to work on Christmas Day, which is a federal holiday, since it's not a religious holiday for them. But in many US hospitals and clinics, Muslims and other non-Christians have to take a vacation day when they want to have a day off on their religious holiday. And this is not an uncommon situation. Another example is the widespread habit of describing an American who is Muslim or Jewish as Muslim American or Jewish American, but without being aware that one doesn't use that same qualifier when talking about Christian American. Here, the Muslim or Jew is subsumed under the familiar category American, but is not quite like a real American. This is why the qualifier is necessary. The fourth stage of interreligious competence is then the first stage of religious relativism, and that's acceptance. People have discovered their own cultural religious context, and they can accept the existence of different religio-cultural contexts. People start constructing religion general categories that allow them to generate a range of relevant cultural contrasts among many religions. And they are able to identify how religious differences operate in human interaction. For example, a man knowing and accepting that a Muslim woman might not shake a man's hand when being introduced would not approach a woman who is identifying herself as a Muslim by being veiled, for instance, with his hand outstretched. And then there is an awkward situation, of course. But the awareness and also acceptance of that is some typical of somebody who's already at the stage of acceptance in the interreligious competence. Acceptance, and I want to stress this, of course, does not necessarily mean agreement, but it is respect for behavioral differences and respect for the value differences. And it also does not mean that some differences are not judged negatively, but still the other believer and his or her behavior is perceived as being of equal humanity, of equal value. And a person who's in the stage of acceptance or an interreligious competence usually focuses on the religio-cultural context of behavior and not on acceptance on any and all behavior in any context. And this acceptance comes from the realization that there's not just one good, correct way of life, not just one worldview, and that also in connection with the interreligious competence means that there's not just one true religion. And this, I think, is the hardest part in interreligious dialogue to accept. The fifth stage of interreligious competence, which would be the second stage of religious relativism, is adaptation. There's an awareness of one's own cultural religious culture, an ability to shift one's religious frame of reference and to look at the world through different eyes. and a person would consciously and intentionally change her or his behavior in order to communicate more effectively with someone from another religious culture. And I think for those of you who were here at the last event when Dennis McManus presented the Pope's interaction with the Jewish community, I think this is one of such an example of adaptation where the Pope put himself into the religious framework and the mindset of the Jewish community and their beliefs and reacted. I mean, this was a conscious, intentional act of having the communication, of overcoming some of the differences. And one may say this is almost like an interreligious empathy in which a person temporarily sets aside his or her own worldview, beliefs and assumptions, and intentionally takes on a different set of beliefs and behavior that is appropriate to the other religio-cultural context. Let's imagine how a Muslim might react, or somebody else. The sixth stage of interreligious competence, which is the third stage of religious relativism, is integration. When shifting one's religious perspective becomes a normal part of oneself, the identity, especially the religious identity of the person, becomes a fluid notion, and the person moves around in different religio-cultural contexts and is not necessarily at the center of one religion. One may call such a person a religious marginal. And here we have the danger that this leads to alienation for the person, to a loss of identity. But it can also lead to being in a constructive marginality. Such a person would be, for example, a very skilled interreligious mediator. And the difference between adaptation and integration is not one of quality. I mean, one cannot say that integration is better than adaptation. But adaptation is frequently attained by non-dominant minority group members. For example, Muslims living here in America, or on the other hand, long-term expatriates, if a Christian lives for many years in a Muslim majority country. Such a person will be most likely easier to reach that level of integration where he or she can switch back and forth easily and becomes a normal part of the self to do that without losing one's own identity. What are the lessons to draw from the sequence of attaining interreligious competence? First of all, I think it's the awareness that interreligious dialogue is a process that undergoes stages. While most people will probably get beyond the denial stage very fast, it is still only with a sustained learning experience, with a continuous interreligious dialogue, that the defense and minimization stage can be overcome. And during the defense stage, it's important to examine the similarities between oneself and the other. One may argue that discussions of commonalities among religious traditions, as described earlier at the beginning of my talk, are an essential prerequisite step toward the willingness to recognize and value differences in order to go on to the next stages, especially to reach, and I think that should be our goal, to reach the stages, even if only the first, of religious relativism. So, because even at the stage of minimization, one does not really have a successful interreligious dialogue because the parties are not perceived as equal, not at the same level of humanity. So the desiderata are that one does not stop the dialogue at some point, especially in the early stages, saying, I have tried, I just don't understand these Muslims. But one needs to take steps that ensure that interreligious dialogue goes beyond this shock, rejection, and defense stage, and it becomes a sustained effort at understanding and accepting other religious traditions and cultures. In order to have such a successful interreligious dialogue, I also would like to conceive interreligious dialogue or interreligious competence as an academic discipline, and hence study the effects of interreligious dialogues on attitudes of those involved toward the other religion. How do these attitudes change? What influences them? And I would like to find out more empirically what are the elements that makes this learning process successful. So what are good teaching strategies? Which forms of dialogue are successful, which are not? And I mean, I'm not saying that efforts in this regard are not underway. I mean, the Berkeley Center here at Georgetown, for example, has surveyed undergraduates on their attitudes when they came in as a fresh person, on their attitudes toward other religions. And they are planning to survey not necessarily the same, but the same cohort over the course of their studies here at Georgetown. And then we can really see more empirically what are the activities, courses, the type of interaction that facilitates interreligious dialogue and understanding. And in order to build the groundwork for interreligious dialogue, I would also like to see a broader dissemination of studies such as Ronald Inglehart's World Values Survey that explores the attitudes of people of different cultures and religions toward values that are deemed important in our globalized world, namely democracy, freedom, liberty, human rights, position of women. Because his studies show that there's actually very little different but a large common ground in the attitudes towards these values expressed by Muslims living in, or people living in majority Muslim societies such as Egypt, and people living in a majority Christian country like the US. And so, to conclude, I would like to see not only a sustained interreligious dialogue, but also an academic study of the mechanisms that foster understanding and acceptance of other religio-cultural contexts, so that we know more precisely about the perils and chances of interreligious dialogue. Thank you very much.
Carefully crafted presentation, and I'm sure you'll be willing to entertain questions
sure.
From the group.
Please.
Becky Johnson, over at the Public Policy Institute. I am not a scholar of Islam, so I apologize if this question sounds somewhat basic. But my understanding is that Muslims have a special relationship with Jews and Christians, that we're identified as Christians as being Dhimmi and Jews as well. Right? We're all people of the book. And there's a sense of equality in that relationship, I think, where I could see interreligious dialogue within the Abrahamic faiths moving through all 6 steps. But I wonder if you could speak about how that would be different with individuals who aren't part of the Abrahamic faith,
Yes.
a Hindu or a Buddhist,
Yes.
who don't have that same theological equality.
Yeah. I mean, this is, of course, the talk was referring mainly to Muslim-Christian dialogue. But I do think that you go through the same stages, even if you say you're talking Muslim-Buddhist, Muslim-Hindu dialogue. But the elements, it will be probably that some stages will take longer to be overcome or move through rather, because the commonalities are not as apparent and maybe not as obvious and easily to make. And this is why at the beginning of the talk I said it's hard to find a definition for what is religion because they're so various. But there are commonalities, and as always in a dialogue, there needs to be willingness to have the dialogue and to have and seeking that type of understanding. On the other hand, if you look historically, Muslims and Hindus lived relatively peaceful together on the subcontinent. It's not that there was a general outright war against Hindus. The same with initially in the earlier years of the Islamic history. Zoroastrians are not a protected minority as Christians and Jews, but they weren't persecuted necessarily. In the end, there was an assimilation, an absorption of the Zoroastrian believers into Islam, but it was a long process. It wasn't from one day to the other, and during that time, they were also accepted. And I think here it's very hard, and this is why religions are very close to the heart, let's say this way, and is frequently for many people a very important part of their identity. And so I think this is why there has to be maybe extra effort. And this is also why I would propose to have this more academic, empirical studies. What works? What doesn't work? And that can be the same then with Muslim, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist dialogue. But I know this is not a real satisfactory answer. Elisa.
Maybe be a little bit more explicit about some of the later stages in the process, because I think it's very interesting that you use this cultural model, but in my opinion, one of the differences between culture and religion is that culture is more relative and doesn't usually claim the same exclusiveness for itself. But many religions do. Like you said, they claim that they are the right way. Would you say that in order to have effective dialogue, that people would have to renounce their religious beliefs?
Not renounce their religious beliefs, but accept that that's not the only true religion what they have. And this is, as I said earlier, this is the difficult part, because it is, and I totally agree with you, that there is a difference between religion and culture, but it's not, there is an interaction. And I think we maybe by having a culture of accepting the other, and this is, for example, what is also happening. I mean, whether now in the US or if you go to Egypt, Copts are Egyptian citizens in the same manner as Muslims are. So we have a culture where there is an acceptance, whereas prior to the nation-state system and citizenship as a concept, that was dhimmis, non-Muslim minorities, particularly Christian and Jews, were protected. They did not have the same rights. But practically right now in Egypt, a Copt has the same rights as a Muslim. And so I think here we have to foster a culture that accepts that human beings are equal of worth and in their beliefs and their rights apart from their religious beliefs. And then we can move on to that and have a real dialogue that goes beyond the stage of seeing the other religion as less. But I don't say that this is an easy process, and this is why I think it is so important to have the sustained dialogue and find what is, how do we create such a culture in which the religious differences are accepted. I mean, we do accept that the cultural differences. But at some point, and I know we're not there, but at some point I would hope that a majority of the population is at the point where they can accept that another religion is different but it's fine. But that also means, and this is, I think, what I hope came out as well, in the aim of religious relativism is much more self-centered, that one's self becomes so firm in one's belief that knowledge and accepting another person's religious beliefs is not a threat to one's identity. And this is the real danger at the very last stage of integration, that you don't know where you stand anymore in your own beliefs. And if you cannot do that, then you probably can't really accept as an equal another religious belief. Peter?
Just to sort of pick up a little bit on some of the things you've just shared. Certainly many religions have a proselytizing element to them, and that there's always, I guess, a suspicion amongst many of interreligious dialogue that that's really what's at the heart of it, and others will say both can coexist. Or could you say a little bit about how you see that element of outreach between communities, with how that features into this whole process?
Yes, I mean, I did not go in all of the details of the intercultural competence sequencing. And there's also some of the, and I think proselytizing is, in many religions, and missionizing is part of that religion. And there it really depends to whom you're addressing this. If you're addressing your, let's say, Islamic or Muslim message, or the message of Islam, to a Christian who is very firm in his or her beliefs, and at the stage where they can accept another religion as an equal, then you will not have probably very little chances of converting the person. If, however, that person is in this stage of religiocentrism, then it is much easier, because then there's also the opposite, the flip reaction that can occur. You embrace the other the moment you know, you get more aware of it, and you say, "Oh, this. If I look back, one of my 3 generations down, one of my great grandmothers was 1/10 Muslim, so I have something Muslim in me as well." And then you embrace that religious culture, and that would be probably then converting to Islam, or converting away from Islam. But yeah, that is of course a problem, and especially then in the I think in the long run, missionary proselytizing almost. If our goal is to come to the stage of religious relativism and acceptance of another religion and religious tradition and culture as an equal, we also have to some extent, give up on an aggressive missionizing and proselytizing, because then I don't think you still then don't treat the person as equal. Katrin?
Professor, do you think that in an academic environment where students try to engage in this interreligious dialogue and attempt at least to study each other's scriptures, the scriptures from the other side, that acceptance is enough, or should it be adaptation really?
I think acceptance would be enough. I mean, adaptation, I think if you accept the other religion, then you also will adapt in that context. If you're if you have a party where you know Muslims are coming to you, you would not serve pork. That's part of adaptation as well, this awareness and this acceptance that this is, that's okay. It's not weird. You wouldn't sneak some pork in there and say, oh yeah, or anything.
But I thought I had understood from how you describe acceptance that it didn't mean that you are capable of stepping out of your own framework of reference.
And this is where I say these borders are fluid. I mean, I think if you're at the very beginning of acceptance, not necessarily, but the more you know about the other's frame of reference and mind work, the more you will be able to do that. But again, this is a process, and there are stages, and not everybody will go through all the stages or ever have a denial or defense stage necessarily. But this is part of how one's own worldview is shaped, and one's own socialization and acculturation in one's religion and culture is happening. Yeah. Hiba?
I was wondering if any of these stages are by any means age-related, like.
I don't think that they're necessarily age-related, but knowledge-related, learning-related. I mean, you may say developmental if you look at a child. Yes, a child doesn't know the differences. I mean, we'll start here from adult life where one is also conscious about one's own religious beliefs and knows about them. So you can at that stage. So and certainly late adolescent, early adult stage. Please.
Berkeley Center, Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. So I guess many of us are here because of the intersection of religion and conflict in world affairs today. It seems to me that religious conflict is frequently a product of the breakup of empires. When we think of Europe, the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, Protestant Reformation, a century of wars of religion. The 20th century is a century of the breakup of empires. First World War, Ottoman Empire breaks up, Austro-Hungarian. Second World War, French and British. End of Cold War, Soviet Empire. So you have all these new countries, each wanting to establish their legitimacy. I go back to Europe, Reformation, on the basis of religion. What makes us distinctive? The association of the state with a particular religion, which provides it with its distinctive identity. And it seems to me that is part of the problem we are dealing with now, especially when you have a competition for land. The big problem here, the overwhelming, I think, is the Middle East. You know, when people say, this is my sacred land, and another people, because you were mentioning the sacred, it's identification with the sacred, with a place. Another people says, this is my sacred land. What is the dialogue over that? That's my real concern, when it centers on a point of land.
And here I'm talking in the ideal. Of course, and I don't think this is, I don't want to sound elitist in this regard, but I don't think that in the near future each and everybody will reach a higher or one of the later stages of interreligious competence. But, and this is what I was mentioning before, some people do. But especially if these are the people who are in power, in a position to change things. For example, if some of the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim religious leaders recognize that, yes, this is the sacred land for all three. How do we accept this? It's not just ours. Yani, they are already at a stage of religious relativism, such as the Pope. But then say, okay, how do we deal with this? We divvy it up. We give equal rights and access to that land. Or there has to be, I totally agree, this is what I'm saying is to some extent quite abstract, and it comes down to these decisions and the decision makers. And I think there it is important that the decision makers are in the realm of religious relativism in order to be able to have a sensitivity and awareness of the demands, the mindset, the framework, the religious framework of the other, and then are implementing it in a manner that is agreeable to all of them. I don't say that this is not difficult, but there in the end, as in Europe after the Reformation, the population will follow once the leaders decide.
Has religion conflict happened only at the time of the break of civilization, or also happened in between civilizations that were in the peak of the power? Because at times when there were civilization not breaking, still religious conflict was there, all times. I'm not sure, I'm just asking because you said religious conflicts happens at the time when
I think that
civilization.
really in the modern world, if we, you can maybe say that, I'm thinking pre-modern, but in the modern world, which we generally take like about 1500 forward, we talk about the modern. It seems to me to be more associated with the breakup of empires. I mean, I just look at this Holy Roman Empire, and then you didn't have, I think that's what struck us in the 19th century. You really didn't, I can't think so much of religion in that sense, except as you move more into the 20th, and particularly as the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of these conflicts start out as national conflicts, but over time, the religion seems to be more of a unifying factor. I mean, you just take a look at what's been going on in the Israel-Arab conflict, and so on. And even, I mean, you mentioned South Asia, the growth of Hinduism, as this conflict has intensified, not just on Islam, but this is something relatively new. Only about 1990 has it really gathered strength.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of this clash, as they combine, something has to be used to justify all this sacrifice, all this fighting. And religion seems to be more of a justifying mechanism.
Also, once come up is national, is more of a religion conflict or national feeling conflict. For example, if we take the situation in Iraq today, and Iraq is creation of a state that was created after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and other parts of that part. Some Iraqi was giving a talk yesterday, and he said, this conflict is not about religion. This conflict is about a power occupying the land for another power, an army occupying the land for another army. Whether you put religion or you take religion, whether it's Sunni or Shiite, Buddhist, there will be always that conflict that is a result of the national feelings of certain people when their land is occupied by another military power that they don't accept. You will have that conflict in all cases.
Yeah, but you're looking at Iraq, that's not an issue of state formation. What I'm talking about is state formation with the breakup of empires. The one that really struck me with the breakup, with the end of the Cold War, was Yugoslavia. And it breaks down along basically confessional lines. That I thought was stunning.
Yeah. But I think I also mentioned it earlier. I mean, next to nationalism, religion is, and this was pointed out earlier, this has can demand a loyalty, can demand a sacrifice, as you were also saying. And I think this is where the worldview of religion and the notion of salvation and also of providing a code for what is right, what is wrong, and this is where the power of religion comes in, and it can be interpreted. I mean, religion is interpretation in the end. Any type of expression does not occur in a vacuum, but is interpreted according to one's environment. And so if there is an environment like with the breakdown of Yugoslavia, that you have a struggle, and for some it seemed, this is a struggle for survival, it's a struggle for power, then you can mobilize that. And people's identities, self-conceptions are very closely tied to their religious identity. This is the group they go to church with, to the mosque with. They know these from usually childhood on. So these are bonds that are being strengthened deliberately, of course, also in order to, what I said about traditionalism, you want the self-preservation of the group, of the religion, is a very strong element in religions. And so at these times when other bonds may not be as strong anymore, that is the closest bond. But yeah, the power of it is quite frightening.
I was thinking more about the Middle East, the conflicts in the Middle East. Take Egypt, take Algeria, North Africa. And when you look at those long conflicts that were in the 20th century and the end of the 20th century, were not as a result of religion. They were as a result of some political, economic factors, and then the religious groups jumped on the wagon of a politically charged situation. And then sometimes we will, I feel I have this thing going on in my mind as someone who comes from the Middle East, that we talk about religion when the issue is actually political or economic or social, and that's where we be looking into.
There's one more question back there.
Outside religions, there's a conscience of life. Everyone wants their baby to live up and grow. The basic priorities, life.
Well, maybe it's about religion, maybe it's about politics, maybe it's about power. I will take the power to and to thank Professor Opwis.
I thank you.
If you wish to ask your questions additionally, I'm sure you'll be on for
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
So thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks for